Welcome to Truth Behind History. If you've ever wondered how we got from big government programs and economic safety nets to a world obsessed with markets, privatization, and deregulation, you're in the right place. Because today, we're unraveling the story of neoliberalism, an economic philosophy that's reshaped entire nations, toppled governments, and sparked fierce global debate. So, what exactly is neoliberalism? Think of it as an approach to running the economy that champions free markets, minimal government intervention, and a whole lot of faith in the invisible hand. It became the dominant economic force starting in the late 20th century, and its fingerprints are everywhere, from Chile to Wall Street, from the halls of the IMF to the streets of London. In this video, we'll start by understanding what neoliberalism is, how it emerged, and why Chile, yes, Chile, became ground zero for this global experiment. We'll look at the influence of powerful economists, the rise of leaders like Reagan and Thatcher, and the role of institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And of course, we'll dig into the heated debates it has stirred about inequality, democracy, and the future of economic policy. So buckle in, because we're about to trace the rise, spread, and consequences of neoliberalism around the world. Let's get into it. Alright, before we dive into the global drama, let's lay the groundwork. What exactly is neoliberalism? Well, at its core, it's an economic philosophy that puts markets on a pedestal. The basic idea is that free markets know best. So instead of governments running industries or trying to micromanage the economy, neoliberalism says, let the private sector handle it. This approach advocates for things like privatization, which means transferring ownership of public services to private companies. It pushes for deregulation, meaning fewer rules on businesses. And it calls for reducing public spending, especially on things like welfare, in favor of letting market forces sort everything out. But who came up with these ideas? Enter two towering figures in economic thought, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. Hayek warned that too much government control leads to tyranny, while Friedman was all about monetarism and personal freedom. He believed that limiting the role of the state wasn't just good economics, it was essential for individual liberty. These two thinkers laid the intellectual foundation for what would become neoliberalism. Now, to really understand neoliberalism, we have to contrast it with what came before. That would be Keynesianism. After World War II, Keynesian economics dominated. It emphasized government spending, social programs, and state intervention to stabilize the economy. But neoliberalism flipped that script. It argued that government intervention actually made things worse, leading to inefficiency, inflation, and stagnation. Instead, neoliberalism embraced self-regulating markets, free trade, and fiscal austerity. So, in a nutshell, neoliberalism is about shrinking the state and trusting the market. But as we'll see, this shift didn't happen overnight. It took a crisis to open the door. Let's talk about that next. Now, let's talk about the moment when the economic world got flipped upside down, the 1970s. This decade was like a pressure cooker for the global economy, and at the heart of it was a problem that traditional economists didn't know how to handle. That problem was stagflation. Sounds like a made-up word, right? But it's very real, and very strange. It's when high inflation and high unemployment happen at the same time. According to Keynesian theory, that wasn't supposed to happen. If people were out of work, prices should fall. If prices were rising, it should mean the economy was booming. But in the 1970s, both went up together. Surprise! This weird mix broke the confidence people had in the old economic rules. And it got worse with the oil crisis in 1973. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, better known as OPEC, decided to cut oil production and raise prices. That move caused the cost of oil to skyrocket. In fact, prices quadrupled. This wasn't just about filling up your gas tank. Oil is the lifeblood of modern economies. So when oil prices went through the roof, it triggered massive global energy shocks, disrupted supply chains, and pushed inflation even higher. Governments scrambled to respond, but the usual Keynesian tools weren't cutting it. They were stuck. Stimulus spending made inflation worse, but cutting spending hurt employment even more. It was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. This crisis cracked open the door for new ideas. And that's where neoliberalism began to creep in. The old belief in government-led solutions was falling apart, and people were ready for a radical shift. Next up, we zoom in on a country that became the testing ground for this shift, Chile. Before Chile became the world's first full-scale neoliberal experiment, it was moving in a completely different direction, towards socialism. And at the center of that shift was Salvador Allende. In 1970, Allende became the first democratically elected Marxist president in the world. That alone was historic. His vision for Chile was bold. He aimed to redistribute wealth, nationalize key industries, and expand access to education and healthcare. He wanted to bring the means of production into public hands and empower the working class. One of his biggest moves was the nationalization of Chile's copper industry. Now, copper was a big deal. It was the country's top export and source of revenue. But many of the major copper companies were owned by US firms. So when Allende nationalized them without compensation, it sent shockwaves through international business circles and Washington, D.C. It was a bold move meant to assert economic sovereignty, but it also invited retaliation. Inside the country, the economy was under strain. Allende's government raised wages and froze prices in an effort to help workers. But this triggered inflation and created shortages. People lined up for basic goods. The middle and upper classes started to panic, and political tensions exploded. Chile became deeply polarized. Supporters saw Allende as a champion of justice. Opponents painted him as a dangerous radical. There were strikes, protests, and increasing signs of unrest. The economy was teetering, and behind the scenes, powerful actors were already working to bring his government down. This tension set the stage for what would come next, the dramatic coup that would change Chile forever. September 11, 1973. While Americans were remembering a different event decades later, this date marked one of the most dramatic turning points in Latin American history. On this day, the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, launched a violent coup against President Salvador Allende. Tanks rolled through Santiago. Fighter jets bombed the presidential palace. And inside that palace, Allende refused to surrender. He gave one final radio address to the nation, defending his vision and his democracy, before taking his own life rather than being captured. It was the end of his government, and the beginning of something entirely new. The military swiftly took control, dissolving Congress and suspending the constitution. Civil liberties were crushed, political parties were banned, and the regime began what it called a campaign to restore order, but in reality, it was a brutal crackdown on dissent. Thousands were arrested. Many were tortured. Some simply disappeared. The Pinochet dictatorship would last for 17 years, and it wasn't just about silencing political opposition. It was also about transforming the Chilean economy in a way the world had never seen. And that brings us to a very curious alliance between a repressive military regime and a group of economists from the University of Chicago. Let's meet them next. Now here's where things take a wild turn. After the coup, General Pinochet didn't just want to crush socialism, he wanted to reinvent Chile's economy from the ground up. And to do that, he turned to a surprising group of people, a circle of Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago, often called the Chicago Boys. These weren't your average policy wonks. They were disciples of Milton Friedman, the high priest of free market economics. They believed in deregulation, privatization, cutting government spending, basically, unleashing the full force of capitalism with as little interference as possible. And they saw Chile as a blank slate, a place where they could finally put theory into action. Now, under normal democratic conditions, these kinds of radical changes would have been nearly impossible. Voters, unions, and political parties would have pushed back. But this was a dictatorship. Pinochet's regime didn't need permission. It didn't care about public opinion. So the Chicago Boys were given unprecedented power to reshape the economy however they wanted. This alliance was strange, even contradictory. On one hand, the government was brutally authoritarian, crushing civil liberties and ruling through fear. On the other hand, it was experimenting with the freest of free market principles. You had political repression paired with economic liberalism. Freedom for capital, but not for people. This was the beginning of what many would later call shock therapy, a rapid, sweeping transformation meant to jolt the economy into a new state. It was risky, it was extreme, and it would make Chile the world's first full-blown neoliberal laboratory. Let's take a look at what they actually did. Alright, now the gloves came off. With political opposition silenced and power centralized under Pinochet, the Chicago Boys got to work, and they didn't hold back. What followed was one of the most radical economic overhauls in modern history. First up, privatization. State-owned enterprises were sold off by the dozens. From banks to utilities to transportation, the idea was simple: the private sector, not the government, should own and operate the economy. Even Social Security was restructured into private pension accounts. It was a massive shift. Then came deregulation. Price controls? Gone. Subsidies? Slashed. Trade barriers? Torn down. Chile opened up its markets to the world, eliminating tariffs and welcoming foreign investment. It went from a relatively closed economy to one of the most open in the developing world almost overnight. And don't forget fiscal austerity. Public spending was cut dramatically, especially in areas like healthcare, education, and housing. The logic? Government should be lean, and the market should handle the rest. Of course, this left many vulnerable groups with less support than ever before. Inflation was tackled with strict monetary policies, often at the expense of short-term employment and wages. But for the Chicago boys, this was all part of the cure. The economy had been sick, bloated by socialism, and now it needed tough medicine. It wasn't just about fixing numbers on a spreadsheet. This was a full-blown ideological project. The goal wasn't simply economic growth, it was to prove that neoliberalism could work, even under the harshest conditions. But how did it actually play out? Let's talk about the results. So, did it work? Well, that depends on who you ask. The neoliberal experiment in Chile produced some dramatic results, both positive and negative. Let's start with the numbers. Over time, Chile's economy began to grow. Inflation, which had been spiraling out of control under Allende, was brought down. Foreign investment flowed in. Exports boomed, especially in copper and agriculture. By the late 1980s, Chile was being hailed by some as a Latin American success story. The Chicago boys had created what they called the miracle of Chile. But that's only part of the picture. The growth wasn't shared equally. Income inequality skyrocketed. The rich got much richer, while the poor often got left behind. Social services had been gutted, so access to healthcare and education became more unequal. Many Chileans, especially in rural or working-class communities, faced rising costs and limited support. Unemployment also remained high during the early years of reform, and poverty increased before it began to fall. In short, the pain was front-loaded, and the gains were uneven. Supporters said the long-term benefits were worth it. Critics said the cost to human well-being and democracy was too high. And remember, this wasn't happening in a democracy. It was a dictatorship. So even if people were suffering, they couldn't vote the policies out. They couldn't protest without fear. The system didn't allow for public debate or adjustment. It was economic reform by force. Chile became a case study, one that economists, politicians, and activists still argue about today. Was it a miracle? Or a warning? To understand how this model spread beyond Chile, let's look at where it went next, straight into the hands of the world's biggest players. After Chile, neoliberalism didn't just stay in the lab. It went global, and fast, and leading the charge were two of the most powerful institutions in the world, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. Now, these weren't just any organizations. They held the keys to financial assistance for countries in crisis. If your nation was drowning in debt, dealing with runaway inflation, or on the brink of default, chances are you'd go knocking on the doors of the IMF or the World Bank. But here's the catch, the money came with strings attached, and those strings were called structural adjustment programs. These programs were basically economic makeovers. Countries had to agree to cut government spending, open up their markets, privatize public industries, and remove trade barriers. Sound familiar? That's right. The same neoliberal formula tested in Chile was now being rolled out across the developing world. Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, entire regions found themselves adopting neoliberal policies not necessarily because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. They needed the loans, and the IMF and World Bank said, sure, but first, cut that spending. Sell off those state enterprises. Let the market breathe. Supporters said these reforms would modernize economies, make them more competitive, and get them back on track. But in practice, it often meant deep cuts to education, healthcare, and public services, things that millions relied on just to survive. And because these programs were so widespread and so powerful, neoliberalism became more than just an idea, it became a global default setting. It wasn't just policy anymore, it was the new normal, but it wasn't without backlash. And some of the fiercest reactions came from the very people expected to live under these new rules. We'll explore that pushback soon, but first, let's take a look at how neoliberalism played out in one of the world's leading democracies, the United Kingdom. Now, let's hop across the Atlantic and take a closer look at a major player in the neoliberal story, the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, right after a period of economic chaos in Britain. The country was dealing with high inflation, frequent labor strikes, and what many called a crisis of confidence. To Thatcher, this wasn't just an economic mess, it was proof that the post-war model of government intervention and social welfare had failed. So, she took a page straight out of the neoliberal playbook. And she didn't just borrow it, she practically turned it into her personal political Bible. Thatcher slashed public spending, especially on housing and social services. She privatized major state-run industries like British Telecom, British Gas, and British Airways. She broke the power of the trade unions, most famously during the miners' strike of 1984 to 1985. And she reduced income taxes, particularly for the wealthy, believing that wealth would trickle down and benefit the whole economy. Her motto? There is no alternative. She believed markets were the only way forward. Government, in her eyes, wasn't the solution, it was the problem. Now, economically speaking, the results were mixed. Inflation dropped, and productivity in some sectors improved. But unemployment surged in the early years. Entire communities, especially those built around manufacturing and mining, were devastated. Income inequality increased. The social fabric of Britain changed, and not everyone agreed it was for the better. Politically, Thatcher was a polarizing figure. Her supporters called her the Iron Lady, a tough reformer who rescued Britain from decline. Her critics said she gutted the welfare state and left the working class behind. Regardless of which side you fall on, one thing's clear: Thatcher made neoliberalism a defining force in British politics and set the stage for its continued rise across the Western world. Next, we'll see how this model wasn't just for developed nations. Neoliberalism found its way into the global South as well, and the consequences were just as far-reaching. Now let's talk about the global South, the developing nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that found themselves swept up in the wave of neoliberal reforms, often without much say in the matter. For many of these countries, the story began with debt. During the 1970s, a lot of nations borrowed heavily, taking on loans to fund infrastructure, development, or just to stay afloat. But by the 1980s, global interest rates soared, and suddenly, those debts became unmanageable. Countries faced balance of payment crises and couldn't meet their financial obligations. Enter the IMF and the World Bank. Their solution? Structural adjustment programs, those same policy packages we saw earlier. Governments were told to cut spending, privatize industries, devalue their currencies, and open their markets to foreign competition. Supporters of this approach argued that it would integrate developing countries into the global economy and encourage growth. And in some cases, you did see improvements in inflation or increased exports. But the costs? They were often devastating. Social services were gutted. Schools and hospitals lost funding. Unemployment rose as state-run industries were sold off or shut down. And because safety nets were being removed at the same time, millions of people were left exposed to the harshest effects of economic change. In countries like Zambia, Nigeria, and Bolivia, structural adjustment became synonymous with hardship. Food prices went up, public sector jobs vanished, protests and civil unrest became common, and beyond economics, there was the issue of sovereignty. These weren't reforms chosen through democratic debate, they were dictated by external institutions. Many critics argued that neoliberalism in the global South was a new form of economic imperialism. It wasn't about development, it was about control. The uneven development that followed left deep scars and fueled resentment that still lingers today. Next, we'll look at how this frustration began to boil over into opposition. As neoliberal policies spread across the globe, so did the backlash. Because for every economist or politician praising market reforms, there were millions of ordinary people living through the consequences, and many weren't happy. In Latin America, for example, the very region that had been ground zero for neoliberal experimentation, mass protests erupted. In Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, citizens took to the streets to oppose austerity measures, rising costs of living, and the privatization of essentials like water and electricity. These weren't just isolated demonstrations, they were movements. Entire populations resisting a model that they felt prioritized profit over people. In Africa and Asia, opposition came in the form of grassroots organizing, labor strikes, and vocal resistance from civil society groups. Many criticized the IMF and World Bank for pushing one-size-fits-all policies that ignored local realities. They argued that these reforms weakened governments, deepened inequality, and undermined democracy. And then there was the rise of alternative models. In the early 2000s, left-wing leaders like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Evo Morales in Bolivia rejected neoliberalism outright. They nationalized industries, expanded social programs, and called for a return to state-led development. Their approaches were controversial and had their own problems, but they represented a clear rejection of the neoliberal status quo. On the global stage, the anti-globalization movement gained momentum. The 1999 protests at the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle marked a turning point. Activists, students, workers, and environmentalists joined forces to challenge the institutions that promoted neoliberalism and to demand a new, more just economic order. Neoliberalism, once presented as the only viable path, was now being openly challenged, and those challenges would only grow louder, especially after the economic shock that came next. Let's talk about that, because in 2008, the entire world felt the consequences of unchecked financial markets. 2008, the year that the neoliberal experiment ran headlong into a brick wall. If you ever needed proof that unchecked markets aren't always a recipe for success, the global financial crisis delivered it in spades. By this point, neoliberalism had firmly taken hold in the financial capitals of the world. Banks were deregulated, markets were liberalized, and risky financial products were allowed to run wild. The logic was simple: let the market decide, and everything will work out. But in 2008, the market didn't just decide, it crashed spectacularly. At the heart of the crisis was the housing bubble in the United States. Banks and financial institutions, encouraged by deregulation and a blind faith in market forces, began making risky mortgage loans to people who couldn't afford them. These subprime loans were bundled into complex financial products and sold off to investors around the world. When housing prices began to fall and people couldn't make their mortgage payments, the entire system collapsed. The result? A global recession, with banks failing, unemployment skyrocketing, and entire economies on the brink of disaster. Governments, many of them still committed to neoliberal principles, found themselves forced to intervene in ways they never imagined. Bailouts for banks? Check. Stimulus packages? Check. The very things that neoliberalism had taught us to avoid were suddenly the only tools left to fix the mess. But it wasn't just the economic failure that was striking, it was the social fallout. While the richest institutions were saved, millions of everyday people lost their jobs, homes, and savings. The crisis exposed the fragility of an economic system that had been built on the idea of minimal regulation and maximum risk-taking. This marked a turning point. Neoliberalism, which had been sold as the savior of the global economy, was now facing an existential crisis. And as the world scrambled to pick up the pieces, the debate about its future and its failings only grew louder. So, what happens after a crisis like this? Well, some turn to a new set of ideas, but others, especially in places like the United States and Europe, began asking, can we really keep going down this path? Let's find out next. After the shock of 2008, the world was left with a massive question mark. If neoliberalism had brought us to the brink of collapse, what should come next? Economists, politicians, activists, even everyday people, started rethinking the foundations of our economic system. Suddenly, ideas that had once been labeled radicals were back on the table. There was renewed interest in regulating financial markets, expanding public services, and addressing inequality more directly. Governments began talking about things like progressive taxation, universal basic income, and climate-focused investments. Institutions that once championed austerity, like the IMF, started to quietly admit that maybe cutting spending during a crisis wasn't always the best idea. The narrative was beginning to shift. Meanwhile, social movements gained momentum. Occupy Wall Street emerged with the rallying cry of "We are the 99%, demanding accountability from the financial elite and a redistribution of wealth and power. In Europe, the rise of new political parties pushed back against neoliberal orthodoxy. Think Podemos in Spain or Syriza in Greece. And let's not forget the role of thinkers and scholars. Books like Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty reignited global conversations about wealth concentration and the long-term effects of inequality. Debates over public ownership, social democracy, and post-capitalist futures weren't just academic, they were starting to shape real policies. But here's the twist: even as these conversations gained ground, neoliberal ideas didn't vanish. In many places, they remained deeply embedded in economic policy, education, and institutions. The system didn't fall, it adjusted, rebranded, sometimes softened, but still very much alive. So, as we move forward, we're left with a mixed legacy, an economic model under scrutiny, challenged by crises, yet still clinging to power. Which brings us to our final reflections. So, what's the legacy of neoliberalism in our world today? Well, it's complicated. On one hand, the fingerprints of neoliberalism are still everywhere. Free trade agreements, privatized services, deregulated industries, and a global economy driven by market logic, these are all remnants of the neoliberal wave that swept the world in the late 20th century. Many governments, even those that criticize the system, still operate within its framework. It's like a software that keeps running quietly in the background, whether we notice it or not. On the other hand, that legacy is under more pressure than ever before. Rising inequality, climate change, housing crises, and the erosion of worker protections have all led to growing dissatisfaction. People are asking, more loudly than ever, whether the market-first model can really deliver justice, stability, and sustainability in the long run. In some places, we've seen moves toward rethinking the role of the state. During the COVID-19 pandemic, even the most market-oriented governments had to step in with massive public spending, stimulus packages, and emergency social programs. It was a reminder that in times of crisis, the state is often the only player big enough to act. At the same time, there's a cultural shift happening. More people are questioning the logic of constant competition, endless growth, and individualism. There's a new interest in community, in cooperation, and in rebalancing the relationship between markets and society. Still, neoliberalism hasn't disappeared. It's evolved. In some cases, it's become more subtle, wrapped in the language of innovation, entrepreneurship, or modernization. But the core ideas remain. The big question now is, what comes next? That's exactly what we'll explore in the conclusion. So here we are, at the end of the journey. Neoliberalism began as a reaction to economic crisis. It promised efficiency, freedom, and prosperity through the power of markets. And for decades, it dominated the global stage, reshaping nations, transforming institutions, and embedding itself into the way we think about economics, politics, and even individual success. But along the way, cracks began to show. Rising inequality, financial instability, and social unrest forced us to confront a hard truth: markets alone can't solve every problem. In many cases, they've created new ones. And while neoliberalism brought growth in some areas, it also left a trail of dislocation, frustration, and exclusion. Today, we live in a world that's still reckoning with its legacy. Some are doubling down on market logic, others are pushing back, demanding new systems that put people and the planet first. And many are simply caught in the middle, living with the consequences of decisions made decades ago. History doesn't offer easy answers, but it does help us ask better questions. And maybe that's the most important takeaway from this story, not just understanding how neoliberalism rose and spread, but thinking critically about what kind of future we want to build. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you found this video insightful, make sure to give it a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the ideas and events that shaped our world. And if you're a fellow history nerd, check out our other videos. You might just discover something that changes the way you see the past and the present. Until next time, stay curious.